A woman was found dead in her own bedroom. Her two sons, who lived with her in the same house, heard and saw nothing. Detectives started investigating, but they couldn't find the culprit. It took 38 years for a breakthrough in the case, but nobody was prepared for the truth that emerged. Linda Slatton was born in 1950 in the state of Alabama, USA. She had loving parents and a younger sister named Judy. From an early age, Linda was ambitious and kind-hearted. She always tried to help others, which earned her many friends. Later, she married a man named Frank, with whom she had two sons, Jeff and Tim. However, as the years went by, their marriage became increasingly problematic. Frank developed an alcohol addiction and started to abuse his wife and children. Eventually, Linda left and decided to move to Florida with her sons. They settled in the city of Lakeland, where Linda's parents and sister already lived. Linda rented a house in a residential complex by the lake and dedicated all her time to providing for her sons. Linda took various jobs, but money was always tight for her. Sometimes she had to sell her belongings to pay the bills. She couldn't even afford a car, so her elder son, Jeff, had to ride his bicycle to school. Her younger son, Tim, played on a football team, and often he had to ask his coach for a ride home after practice to avoid walking. Despite the financial difficulties, Linda always strived to give her sons the most time and attention she could. She took them on hikes, brought them to concerts of their favorite bands, and overall tried to ensure their childhood was filled with positive moments. On the evening of September 3, 1981, when Linda was 31 years old, she waited for Tim to finish his practice and went with him to the neighbors who were hosting a small family gathering. Meanwhile, Jeff arrived home and wanted to have dinner, but there was hardly any food in the fridge. He got angry at his mother, hopped on his bicycle, and rode to his grandparents' house, who lived on the other side of the city. Later, when the whole family returned home, Jeff argued with his mother about the empty fridge, but eventually they wished each other a good night and went to bed. The next morning, Linda's sister, who lived in the same complex, went to her house to invite her for a cup of coffee. She knocked on the door but received no response. Thinking that Linda had gone somewhere, the woman turned around and was about to leave when she noticed that the bedroom window was open. She approached it, looked inside, and saw Linda lying across the bed. In the next second, the woman screamed and ran to the neighbors to call the police. One look at her sister's face was enough for her to realize that she was dead. Detectives arrived at their house and began examining the crime scene. Linda was lying on her bed, her clothing partially pulled down with a wire hanger around her neck. Based on this evidence, the police suspected that an unknown man had entered the victim's room, assaulted her, and strangled her. Soon, forensic experts confirmed this theory by finding a palm print on the windowsill. Linda often left it open since there was no air conditioning in the apartment, making it easy for the killer to gain access. While the detectives worked at the crime scene, the eldest son of the victim woke up from all the commotion. The investigators took him outside and delivered the tragic news of his mother's death. Afterward, they woke up his younger brother and led him towards the exit. However, at that very moment, as the boy passed by his mother's room, another police officer emerged from it, and through the open door, Tim saw his mother's body and froze in place until the officer pulled him away. Jeff and Tim, aged 15 and 12 at the time, were in deep shock. Initially, they simply couldn't believe that their mother was dead. Later, the investigators managed to talk to them, and the brother stated that they hadn't heard any noise and hadn't even woken up that night. Despite having their own rooms, the detectives found this strange, considering the building had very good acoustics, and given the brutal nature of the murder, loud noises should have been audible from the victim's room. The police interviewed the neighbors, who also hadn't heard anything. None of the residents in the complex had seen any suspicious individuals that day. Medical experts examined the victim's body and confirmed that she had been subjected to violence. They extracted the killer's biological material, but at that time, they couldn't conduct DNA analysis. The experts also confirmed that Linda died as a result of strangulation. Thus, the detectives had to investigate the case with almost no evidence. The palm print could only help them if they managed to find a suspect and make a comparison. Linda's sons moved in with their grandparents. They remained in a state of shock and constantly feared that the unknown killer would come after them. The fear was so intense that they slept in the same room as their grandmother, while their grandfather sat in the living room with a rifle. However, the detectives believed that the children were not in danger. In their opinion, the crime had solely a sexual motive, and the killer must have known the victim. After speaking with Linda's relatives, they learned about her ex-husband, who had a history of domestic violence. He immediately became the prime suspect, but the police quickly determined that the man was in a different state at the time of the murder. Afterward, the investigators discovered that shortly before her death, Linda had started dating a certain man. They located this person, but he also had a solid alibi. The detectives checked all the victim's neighbors, comparing their fingerprints with the sample found on the windowsill. They then conducted a similar comparison with all previously convicted men residing in Lakeland, but they couldn't find any matches. Several weeks after the murder, Linda's sons gradually started to recover, and eventually, the relatives decided that the best option for them would be to return to school. Over time, it did help the brothers as they began interacting with friends again and gradually returned to a normal life. Tim rejoined the football team, as his mother had always been proud of his accomplishments in the sport. A month after her death, he hung a photograph of his team in his bedroom as a reminder of how his mother had taught him to move forward and achieve his goals. Meanwhile, the detectives reached a dead end, failing to find a suitable suspect. They decided to go back to the beginning and reconsider why the sons hadn't heard any screams or signs of a struggle. The police reviewed Jeff's statements and noticed that he had an argument with Linda on the day of her murder. Furthermore, the teenager himself mentioned that he and his mother frequently engaged in verbal disputes. This made the detectives ponder. Could Jeff have killed his mother? They called him in for questioning and started asking various questions again. Soon, Jeff realized that the investigators suspected him of the crime. He denied his involvement, but the detectives continued to pressure him. They offered Jeff to undergo a polygraph test, and he agreed. The polygraph operator did not detect any signs of deception, but the police were not ready to give up. Soon after, they called him in for questioning again and even planned to bring in a hypnotist to put him in a trance state. Jeff constantly faced pressure, and one of the investigators directly accused him of strangling his mother. This led to the breaking point for Linda's relatives, and they demanded that the police focus on finding the real killer and prohibited them from approaching Jeff. Despite this, Jeff agreed to undergo another polygraph test, and after successful results, he was finally no longer considered a suspect. From that point on, the case remained stagnant for many years. Jeff and Tim grew up, got jobs, and started their own families. The murder of their mother still haunted them, but every time they contacted the investigators, they received the same response: no progress had been made in the case. In March 1999, experts extracted a DNA sample from the biological material found on the victim's body. 2 years later, a new detective assigned to the case compared it with samples from all the suspects, including Linda's 2 sons, but there were no matches. Even comparing it with the FBI database yielded no results. When Jeff met with this detective, he realized that they had been acquainted for many years. It turned out that the men regularly played bowling together with mutual friends. They talked, and the investigator promised Jeff that he would solve the case no matter what. Around the same time, Tim and Jeff heard about another unsolved crime that had remained unresolved for many years. After it received widespread media attention, new evidence emerged, leading to the capture of the perpetrator. That's when the brothers decided to approach journalists and share their family tragedy. They gave a detailed interview, and the story made it into the local newspapers. In September 2001, the detective received an interesting lead. He learned that a man named Jimmy Ulmer had abducted a young woman through her bedroom window a year after Linda's murder, for which he received an 80-year prison sentence. What made it even more intriguing was that during Linda's murder, this person lived in the same residential complex just a few meters away from her house. At the time of Ulmer's arrest, the DNA of criminals was not yet entered into a common database since it simply did not exist. The man himself passed away in '96, and there were no remaining biological samples. However, the detective contacted the perpetrator's mother, who provided several personal belongings from which the experts managed to extract a sample. Unfortunately, it did not match the DNA of the killer. But despite the setback, the detective was not ready to give up. He continued to search for new suspects, consistently asked the FBI to run the DNA sample of the killer through all available databases, and stayed in touch with Linda's sons. Unfortunately, in 2015, he encountered health problems that forced him to retire, despite his promise to see the case through to the end. At that point, Jeff and Tim had almost resigned themselves to the thought that they would never find their mother's killer. However, in 2019, a new hope emerged when C.C. Moore, a renowned expert in genetic genealogy, took on the case. She took the DNA sample of the killer and uploaded it to public databases, then began searching for any matches. Typically, such databases can even help find the most distant relatives of the DNA owner, who could be living in different parts of the world without the slightest knowledge of each other's existence. With this information, it is possible to trace their family tree, find common lines, filter out thousands of relatives, and identify the DNA owner. After conducting all this extensive work, Moore was able to pinpoint one family living in the area at the time of the murder. Within that family, there was only one person who fit all the parameters, leading her to conclude that he was highly likely to be the killer. When the detectives heard his name, they immediately realized they had come across him in old reports. His name was Joseph Clinton Mills, Tim's football coach, who regularly gave him a ride home from practice. He had never been on the list of suspects, but back in 1981, the police had taken a statement over the phone as he had dropped Tim off at home on that same day. None of the detectives even considered the possibility that Mills could be the killer. At that time, he was only 20 years old, and there was absolutely no evidence against him, so the police didn't compare his DNA and fingerprints with the samples found at the crime scene. The investigators decided to hold off on informing Jeff and Tim about this discovery. First, they needed to make sure that Mills was truly behind their mother's murder. After studying his biography, they found out that in 1984, Mills was arrested for forgery of a will, and his fingerprints were taken, which are still kept in a paper archive to this day. Experts compared them with the fingerprints found on the victim's windowsill and obtained a perfect match. After 38 years, they finally learned the identity of the probable killer. Immediately after this revelation, the detectives moved on to the final step, obtaining a DNA sample from Mills to compare it with the biological material from the victim's body. They discovered that the man still lived in the same house as in 1981. Mills was now 58 years old, owned a small business, was married, and had children and grandchildren. The detectives monitored him for several weeks, hoping to obtain some item with his DNA. It could have been a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, a bottle, and so on. However, they never had the opportunity, so the police decided to discreetly retrieve his trash. They handed the bag to the laboratory, where experts tried to find an item with his DNA, and soon they succeeded. The results were not long in coming. Mills' DNA matched completely with the sample found on Linda's body. Afterward, the detectives met with her sons to inform them of the progress in the case. They were both shocked, but Tim had a much harder time accepting it. He couldn't believe that his football coach turned out to be the same monster who had killed his mother. Tim respected him and looked up to him, and what's more, Mills continued to give him rides home from practice even after the murder. The man constantly encouraged him and always asked if there were any developments in his mother's case. For all these years, a photo of his football team hung in Tim's old bedroom with the monster who killed his mom standing right behind him. In the same year, Mills was arrested. He remained calm and didn't even ask what he was being accused of. When brought in for questioning and asked about Linda's murder, he claimed to have no involvement. According to him, he dropped off Tim and left. Mills insisted that he never entered their house, but the detectives knew it was a lie. They informed him about the DNA and fingerprint match, after which the suspect suddenly changed his version of events. Now, Mills insisted that on that night, Linda herself invited him to sneak into her bedroom through the window for an intimate encounter. Then she asked him to lightly choke her with a hanger, but Mills miscalculated his strength and ended up killing her. Of course, the detectives didn't believe this story for a second, considering all the existing evidence. They had a much more plausible theory. Based on the fact that Mills had repeatedly given Tim rides home, he had seen his mother and could have targeted her as a victim. On the evening of the murder, he dropped off the boy, who immediately went to a party at the neighbor's house with his mother. Mills took advantage of the fact that no one would be home in their house. He drove away for some distance and then returned on foot, sneaking into Linda's bedroom through the window and hiding in the closet. He spent several hours there, waiting for everyone to go to sleep. In that same closet, he took a wire hanger and used it as a murder weapon. After subjecting the victim to violence, he left the house through the window. Based on all the available evidence, charges were brought against Mills for the murder, and the case was handed over to court. In the state of Florida, the death penalty was a possible sentence for such a crime, and on February 9, 2022, Mills decided to make a deal with the prosecution to avoid this fate. He confessed to the murder, but under the conditions of the agreement, he was not required to disclose the details of the crime. Linda's sons were unhappy with this fact. In the courtroom, Tim shouted at his coach, demanding to know why he took his mother away from him, but the man remained silent, looking down. Only when given the opportunity for a final statement, Mills said, "I'm a good person. I'm not who they're trying to portray me as." This angered the brothers even more, but ultimately, They were grateful to the investigators for bringing the case to a conclusion and finally finding the killer. Mills was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict was delivered, Jeff and Tim promised to try to live honorable lives and dedicate themselves to their families, as that is what their mother would have wanted. Please share your opinions on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.